What you are witnessing right now, in this very week of January 2026, is not a policy announcement. It is a structural fracture. On January 14th, 2026, President Trump signed a proclamation imposing a 25% tariff on certain advanced computing semiconductors, specifically targeting chips like the Nvidia H200 and the AMD MI325X. The tariff went into effect at 1 minute past midnight on January 15th. Within 48 hours, the administration confirmed this was merely a Phase 1 measure. The implication was unmistakable. More is coming. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice. This is an educational analysis based on publicly available information and historical precedent. For the serious observer, the question is not whether these tariffs will reshape the semiconductor industry. The question is how a system built entirely on the premise of frictionless global trade responds when that premise is revoked. To understand this, we need to understand what semiconductor supply chains actually are, how they came to exist in their current form, and why breaking them is not like breaking an egg. It is like breaking a crystal lattice. The modern semiconductor supply chain is the most geographically distributed, technically demanding, and financially leveraged production system in human history. A single advanced chip might be designed in California, fabricated in Taiwan, using machines built in the Netherlands with components sourced from Japan, assembled and tested in Malaysia or Vietnam, then shipped back through distribution hubs in Singapore before finally arriving in a data center in Iowa or a smartphone factory in Shenzhen. This is not inefficiency. This is specialization taken to its logical extreme. Every node in this chain exists because it is or was the most economically optimal location for that specific task. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company fabricates 90% of the world's most advanced chips because TSMC and the ecosystem around it developed capabilities that no other region could match. This was not an accident. It was the product of decades of policy coordination, infrastructure investment, and the development of what the industry calls stickiness, the accumulation of tacit knowledge, supplier relationships, and human capital that cannot be moved by executive order. Now consider what the January 15th tariff does. It imposes a 25% cost on certain chips entering the United States. The administration carved out exemptions for chips used in domestic data centers, for research and development, for consumer goods, and civil industries. But here is the structural point. The tariff is not really about revenue. The White House fact sheet explicitly states that the administration may impose broader tariffs on semiconductors and their derivative products in the near future. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told reporters that the objective is to bring 40% of Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain and production capacity to American soil. He said companies that do not build in America will likely face a 100% tariff. This is not trade policy. This is industrial conscription. For investors holding positions in the companies caught in this transition, the mathematics are unforgiving. Let us examine the three companies most directly exposed. Nvidia, AMD, and TSMC form a tripartite structure where design, fabrication, and value creation are so intertwined that any disruption reverberates through all three simultaneously. Nvidia designs the chips that power the artificial intelligence revolution. These chips are fabricated entirely by TSMC in Taiwan. The H200, which is now subject to the 25% tariff, is a variant of Nvidia's Hopper architecture, one generation behind the current Blackwell and 2 generations behind the forthcoming Rubin chips. But here is the problem. The H200 was not designed for export restriction circumvention like the earlier H20. It was designed for high-performance computing in the United States and other markets, and now it has been caught in a trade mechanism that allows its sale to China in exchange for a quarter of its value going to the federal government. Nvidia's gross margins on AI chips are extraordinary, somewhere between 80 and 85%. This means Nvidia has room to absorb the tariff without catastrophic margin compression. But absorption is not free. Every dollar absorbed is a dollar that does not go to research, does not go to capacity expansion, does not go to shareholders. And when the administration says phase one, the market understands this to mean the cost structure is provisional. What investor prices a company when the regulatory overhang is explicitly temporary, moving towards something worse? AMD occupies a structurally more vulnerable position. Its MI325X is now tariffed alongside Nvidia's products, but AMD lacks Nvidia's pricing power. Where Nvidia commands markets, AMD competes for them. AMD's overall gross margin is approximately 51%, a full 30 percentage points below Nvidia on AI chips. A 25% tariff on AMD's export-bound semiconductors does not compress margins, it eliminates them. The company cannot simply pass the cost to customers because Nvidia already dominates the customer base. AMD's value proposition has always been performance at a discount. That proposition disappears when regulatory costs are applied equally to both competitors. Then there is TSMC. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company reported a 35% surge in fourth quarter profit just hours before the tariff announcement. The company raised its capital expenditure guidance to between $52 and $56 billion for 2026, confirming plans for 11 fabrication plants in Arizona under a $500 billion bilateral trade agreement, announced the same week. On the surface, TSMC appears to be the beneficiary. Dig deeper, and the picture becomes more complex. TSMC's Arizona facilities operate at costs roughly 2.4 times higher than their Taiwan operations. According to analysis from SemiAnalysis, a 5-nanometer wafer costs approximately $6,600 to produce in Taiwan. The same wafer in Arizona costs over $16,000. This cost disparity is not a function of labor inefficiency alone. It reflects the absence of the supplier ecosystem, the logistics infrastructure, and the tacit knowledge accumulated over 40 years in Hsinchu Science Park. TSMC can build fabs in Arizona. What it cannot build is Taiwan. This brings us to the historical pattern that makes this moment so significant. Systems that become dependent on efficiency optimizations are uniquely vulnerable to policy disruptions. The global semiconductor supply chain achieved its current form because frictionless trade allowed every participant to specialize without hedging. When you operate at 2% margins because you trust the system, a 25% tariff is not an adjustment, it is extinction. Consider the analogy to earlier episodes of trade disruption. During the 2018 and 2019 trade war, the United States imposed tariffs on approximately $370 billion of Chinese goods. The average tariff rate on targeted products rose from 3% to 19%. Stock markets experienced pronounced volatility. The S&P 500 fell 4.4% in 2018, one of its worst years of the prior decade. Chinese equities sold off. Supply chains scrambled. Yet by 2020, after the Phase 1 deal and despite a global pandemic, markets had recovered and exceeded their previous highs. Why? Because the 2018-2019 tariffs were applied to a system that retained flexibility. Companies could shift production. Supply chains could reroute. The disruption was real but navigable. The current semiconductor tariff regime operates on fundamentally different terrain. You cannot shift semiconductor fabrication the way you shift garment manufacturing. A leading-edge fab costs upward of $20 billion to construct and takes 3 to 5 years to bring online. The specialized equipment required, particularly ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, has a global production capacity of roughly 60 units per year. There is no spare capacity. There is no alternative supplier. There is only ASML, and ASML is itself dependent on suppliers in Japan and Germany for critical components. When the administration says it wants 40% of Taiwan's semiconductor capacity relocated to American soil, it is describing a physical transformation that cannot happen quickly, regardless of financial incentive. TSMC has been building in Arizona since 2020. The first fab, originally scheduled for 2024, began limited production only last year. The full cluster will not be operational until 2029 at the earliest. In the meantime, every chip that powers American artificial intelligence, American defense systems, American consumer electronics flows through the Taiwan Strait. This is where the systemic risk becomes acute. The tariff policy is designed to force reshoring over a multi-year horizon, but markets do not operate on multi-year horizons. Markets operate on quarterly earnings and forward guidance. What happens to Nvidia's valuation when the market realizes that its entire production infrastructure remains in a geopolitical flashpoint, while the government is actively making that infrastructure more expensive? What happens to AMD's competitive position when its cost structure rises by a quarter while it fights for market share against a monopolist? What happens to portfolio construction when the Magnificent Seven technology stocks, which represent approximately 30% of the S&P 500 by market capitalization, are suddenly subject to policy risk that cannot be hedged? The Institute for Supply Management's Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index fell to 47.9 in December 2025, the lowest reading of the year and the 10th consecutive month of contraction. Survey respondents cited tariffs and trade policy uncertainty as primary factors. This is not a prediction. This is already happening. Manufacturing is already contracting. Business investment is already hesitating. The mechanism is simple. When you cannot know what the cost structure will be in 6 months, you do not commit capital. When you do not commit capital, capacity does not expand. When capacity does not expand, supply constraints persist. When supply constraints persist, prices rise. When prices rise on goods that are not increasing in quality or capability, you have cost-push inflation without productivity gain. This is the worst possible combination for equity valuations. Let me address the common objection that tariffs are merely negotiating tactics, that the administration will ultimately back down, that markets will stabilize. This objection rests on the assumption that the administration's revealed preferences align with market stability. The evidence suggests otherwise. During the first Trump administration, there was a documented sensitivity to stock market performance. When markets sold off sharply, tariff implementation often paused or softened. Current reporting indicates this sensitivity has diminished. The administration has been described as somewhat dismissive of market signals. This is not necessarily irrational from a policy perspective. If the genuine objective is industrial transformation rather than revenue generation, then market volatility is an acceptable cost. The problem is that most portfolios are not constructed to withstand acceptable policy costs. They are constructed on the assumption that policy will bend to markets, not the reverse. The mathematical reality for semiconductor-exposed portfolios is uncomfortable. Nvidia trades at roughly 45 times trailing earnings, with a market capitalization exceeding $4 trillion. This valuation assumes continuation of extraordinary growth, which requires continued dominance in AI infrastructure, which requires uninterrupted access to leading-edge fabrication, which requires geopolitical stability in the Taiwan Strait, and regulatory predictability in Washington. Each link in this chain is now under stress. The tariff is one vector. The ongoing discussion of 100% levies on companies that do not build domestically is another. China's retaliatory posture, evidenced by its weaponization of rare earth exports and its rule changes on chip origin classification, is a third. Nvidia's beta coefficient is approximately 2.3, meaning it amplifies market movements by more than double. In a flight to safety, Nvidia does not decline proportionally. It declines disproportionately. AMD's situation illustrates a different vulnerability. The company's valuation reflects expectations of rapid profit growth, trading at approximately 36 times forward earnings versus 117 times trailing earnings. This spread tells you everything. The market is pricing AMD on what it expects, not what it has delivered. Tariff-induced cost increases directly threaten the narrative that justifies that forward multiple. If AMD cannot grow into its valuation, the valuation contracts to meet the reality. This is not speculation about sentiment. This is arithmetic about earnings. For TSMC, the dynamic is more complex. The company benefits from the administration's desire to see leading-edge fabrication on American soil. It has negotiated tariff concessions that allow it to import equipment and wafers at preferential rates while it builds out its Arizona capacity. But this benefit comes with obligations. TSMC has committed to an expansion that represents a structural departure from its historically Taiwan-centric model. The company is being asked to replicate in Arizona what took decades to build in Taiwan at 2.4 times the cost, in an environment where it must import every piece of specialized equipment and train a workforce that does not yet exist. This is not impossible, but it is expensive, time-consuming, and subject to execution risk that TSMC has never faced at this scale. When the world's most valuable foundry takes on existential execution risk, the downstream effects propagate through every company that depends on its services. The mechanism by which this affects your portfolio is not mysterious. Modern index funds and exchange-traded funds provide broad market exposure, but that exposure is not equally weighted. The largest technology companies dominate the indices. A portfolio tracking the S&P 500 has approximately 7% exposure to Nvidia alone as of recent weightings. Add Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, and Broadcom, and you approach 30% of the index concentrated in companies with direct semiconductor supply chain exposure. This is not diversification. This is concentration risk, disguised as index tracking. The historical pattern suggests that tariff-induced volatility is sharp but recoverable when the underlying system remains intact. The 2018 to 2019 episode saw the S&P 500 decline and then surge once the Phase 1 deal was announced. The recovery was possible because the disruption was navigable. Companies adapted. Supply chains rerouted. The system bent but did not break. The current moment is qualitatively different because the administration's stated objective is to break the system and rebuild it differently. This is not trade negotiation in the traditional sense. This is structural transformation. The $500 billion Taiwan deal, the 11-fab Arizona expansion, the explicit goal of 40% capacity relocation. These are not bargaining positions. They are engineering specifications for a new industrial geography. What this means for the ordinary investor is that the assumptions underlying portfolio construction may need revision. The past decade of technology outperformance was built on globalization, on the ability of American design houses to access the world's most efficient fabrication at the lowest cost, on the free flow of talent and capital across borders. Those conditions are changing. The change is not speculative. It is happening now in regulatory filings, in earnings reports, in executive statements that explicitly acknowledge tariffs as a primary headwind. The question is not whether these changes will affect valuations. The question is whether your portfolio is positioned for the world being built rather than the world that existed. There is no clean resolution to offer here. The semiconductor industry cannot be reshored quickly regardless of policy pressure. The tariff regime cannot achieve its stated objectives in the time frame markets operate on. The companies caught in this transition cannot simultaneously maintain margins, market share, and growth trajectories while absorbing costs that did not exist 2 years ago. Something has to give. In historical episodes of structural transformation, what typically gives first is the equity risk premium, the excess return investors' demand for holding stocks rather than safer assets. When policy uncertainty rises, risk premiums rise. When risk premiums rise, valuations decline even if earnings remain stable. This is not a crash. This is a repricing of risk. The prudent response is not panic. It is not to exit equity markets entirely. It is to understand what you own and why. If your portfolio is heavily weighted towards semiconductor and technology companies, you should understand that these companies are now subject to policy risks that were not present 5 years ago. If your retirement timeline is short, concentration in volatile sectors represents a different risk than it does for someone with decades to recover. If you hold individual positions in Nvidia, AMD, or companies that depend on their products, you should understand that the forward path includes regulatory costs that are explicitly described as phase one of something larger. The administration has stated its intentions clearly. Broader tariffs may come. 100% levies on companies that do not build domestically are on the table. The July 2026 review will determine whether the current tariff scope expands. These are not rumors. These are official statements from White House fact sheets and cabinet officials speaking on the record. The market is processing this information in real time, and the processing is not yet complete. When a system that is optimized for efficiency confronts a policy regime that prioritizes resilience over efficiency, the transition is expensive. The cost is measured in margin compression, in delayed capital deployment, in valuations that contract to reflect new risk. This is the adjustment mechanism. It is already underway. The only question is how much adjustment remains. For the analyst studying systemic risk, the semiconductor tariff moment is a case study in how large economic systems break not from external shock, but from internal policy choice. The United States imports 90% of the chips it requires. This dependency was not an oversight. It was an optimization. The system evolved to place fabrication where fabrication was most efficient and to reserve design where margins are highest for domestic companies. This worked extraordinarily well until policy decided it no longer wanted it to work. The tariff is the mechanism by which policy preference becomes economic reality. The transition from the old equilibrium to whatever replaces it will not be smooth, because the physical infrastructure cannot change as quickly as policy statements. In the interim, the mismatch between policy intent and operational reality manifests as cost. That cost flows through supply chains, through margins, through earnings, through valuations, and ultimately through portfolios. This is how wealth destruction happens structurally, not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulation of costs that each seem manageable in isolation, but compound over time. A 25% tariff sounds modest until you realize it applies to products with 5% net margins. A phase one measure sounds preliminary until you realize phase two includes 100% levies. A 3-year construction timeline sounds reasonable until you realize the policy pressure is applied quarterly. The system does not collapse. It grinds. It grinds down margins, grinds down expectations, grinds down the valuations that were built on assumptions that no longer hold. By the time the new equilibrium arrives, the wealth that existed in the old equilibrium has been transferred, some to government revenue, some to alternative suppliers, some simply destroyed through friction and inefficiency. This is where we are in January 2026. The tariff has been implemented. The phase one language has been deployed. The $500 billion Taiwan deal has been announced. The exemptions have been carved out and the exceptions defined. And still, the market has not fully absorbed what this means, because the full meaning will only become clear as the quarters unfold and the earnings reports arrive and the guidance is revised downward and the risk premiums expand. This is not prediction. This is description of a process that has begun and cannot be reversed by hope or headline. The companies named in the tariff announcement, Nvidia and AMD, are not being destroyed in any literal sense. They remain enormously profitable enterprises with technological leadership that cannot be easily replicated. But their valuations reflect a world that is changing underneath them. The premium the market pays for growth depends on the assumption that growth can continue unimpeded. When impediments are explicitly constructed by the government that hosts your headquarters and grants your export licenses, the growth assumption requires revision. Revision of growth assumptions is revision of valuation. Revision of valuation is what investors experience as loss. Your portfolio is next only in the sense that your portfolio contains these companies or companies that depend on them or indices that weight them heavily. The transmission mechanism is straightforward. The timing is uncertain, but the direction is not. When a government decides to restructure an industry that represents the foundation of technological competitiveness, The restructuring costs are borne by the participants in that industry, and by extension by the investors who own their equity. This is not punishment. This is physics. Value cannot be created or destroyed by policy. It can only be moved, and movement always involves friction. Friction is cost. Cost is loss. Loss is what we are analyzing. The prudent investor does not need to predict the future with precision. The prudent investor needs to understand the dynamics that are already in motion and position accordingly. The semiconductor tariff regime is not a future risk. It is a present reality that went into effect 48 hours ago. The next phases have been telegraphed explicitly. The cost structure of the industry is changing in real time. Portfolios constructed on the assumption of the old cost structure will underperform portfolios constructed on the assumption of the new one. This is not advice about what to buy or sell. This is observation about how systems respond to policy shock. The system is responding now. Whether your portfolio responds with it is a matter of attention, understanding, and willingness to act on what the evidence reveals, rather than what you wish were true. This is how it happens, not with a crash, but with a grind. Not with panic, but with repricing. Not with prediction, but with recognition that the structure has changed and the implications must follow. Welcome to Phase 1.